The Addiction Podcast, Point of No Return.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Addiction Podcast, Point of No Return. My name is Joni Siegel, and I'm the host for this podcast. My husband, Steve Siegel, is the producer of the podcast. If you have a story you'd like to share with us on the podcast, please reach out. Our email is theaddictionpodcast@yahoo.com. Today's episode is episode number 290. Just a reminder to please subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, and also give us a good review, because then people, when they Google help for addiction, our podcast will come up. And sometimes people just need to know that they're not alone. Also, check out our YouTube channel. It's the same name, The Addiction Podcast, Point of No Return, and subscribe and give our videos a thumbs up. And if you would like to be notified when we have a new podcast up, ring the bell. Today's episode is an interview with an author. Her name is Beverley Thomson. Beverley is a writer, researcher, and speaker with a focus on psychiatric medication, including antidepressants, benzodiazepines, and ADHD drugs. Their history, how the drugs work, adverse effects, dependence, withdrawal, and development of patient support services. She has written a book that we're going to talk about called Antidepressed, a breakthrough examination of epidemic antidepressant harm and dependence. I think that this is particularly relevant in today's society because antidepressants are all over the media and they are advertised everywhere, and she's got a very good perspective on this dangerous type of medication. So without further ado, let's talk to Beverley Thomson. Beverley Thomson, thank you so much for being willing to talk to us today. I'm super excited to talk about your book.
Thank you for inviting me to talk with you.
Absolutely. But give me your background. Where did you grow up? And, what kind of led you down the path of even writing this book?
Okay. Well, I live in the Highlands of Scotland, but I grew up in Yorkshire in England. I
was going to say, I don't think that's a Scottish accent.
Yeah, it's very much a hybrid accent nowadays because I've lived in so many places, and I've always moved north all the time. Every time I move, it's further north, and my friends kind of joke that I'm going to end up in Iceland, which I probably will eventually. So I am a writer and a researcher. As you said, I focus on psychiatric medication, so particularly antidepressants and benzodiazepines. I was a counsellor in primary and secondary schools. And I started to notice that lots was changing in terms of, how we were starting to judge children very much for the situations or coping with the situations that they were finding themselves in. So whether it be school problems, home problems, we were starting to ask questions such as, or make statements such as, I think there's something wrong with him or her, or I think this child has ADHD. And that kind of sparked something in me. And I thought, I really need to find out what's going on here. And I remember somebody once said to me that when you realize something's wrong, you have a responsibility to tell others. And I actually realized really, really quickly and really early when I started doing this work that many things are very wrong when it comes to psychiatric drugs. And the drugs that we were starting to give our children in particular. And I started to read, I think I've read thousands and listened to thousands and thousands of patient experiences of people taking psychiatric drugs. And I kind of started to realize that patient experiences painted a very different picture to the ones that the pharmaceutical industry and the media portrayed when it came to, in particular, antidepressants. So I suppose the more patient more patient experiences I read, the more I realized that the voices of these people who were suffering sometimes incredible harm actually needed to be heard.
Right. I'm going to take you back just a little bit. Thank you for all of that. So you were a counselor in school. Like, I guess in this country, we call them school resource officers, maybe.
Yeah.
But what training led you to that? Were you a psychology major? What was your degree?
Actually, my two degrees are in languages and marketing.
Okay.
And then I studied Open University psychology.
Okay. So, how long ago was this that you were counseling in schools that you started to notice this?
Probably about 12 years ago. And I think we're obviously a little bit behind the situation that you're in the States.
Yeah.
So it's probably, around 12 to 15 years ago, I would say, when I first started to realize that things were changing.
Yes. Yes.
And you know, Joni, this wasn't just the teachers talking like this. It was parents talking like this as well.
Yep.
So, you know, it was the whole societal change that was happening. And this got me intrigued.
And I think, you know, we're in a society today where both parents have to work, so they're not at home, and, you know, children are children. And, you know, I've heard the phrase, you know, childhood is not a mental disorder. And that's really the point that, you know, I have a grandson. He can bounce off the walls, but he doesn't have a mental disorder. He's a 5-year-old boy. And I raised boys, and boys are supposed to climb on things and jump off of things and, you know, do what they do. And I think that with parents getting busier, sometimes they don't know how to deal with this. And a pill can become a quick fix, but it's not. And you can talk more about that. It's not a quick fix.
Not a quick fix. And you know, the problem is that it's become so culturally acceptable, isn't it, to turn to a pill before you ask the real questions about what is going on in somebody's life.
Yep.
And most of the time, as I often say, if we really look at what's going on in somebody's life, we can work out why they're feeling depressed or anxious or, you know, not coping with what's going on. So going down the biochemical route of treating somebody's disease with a pill, a life-changing pill often, is really something that we don't need to do.
I agree. And I have said this before on the podcast because I watched a documentary called Generation RX. Yeah. And the problem, I think, with some of these psychiatric drugs is that you might take an antidepressant, Beverly, and it's fine and it doesn't affect you. Maybe you get a little happier, but I might take an antidepressant and go off and get a gun and shoot someone. And I know that sounds radical, but if you watch this film, you know, there's a father who never had a history of violence and was put on antidepressants, and that's exactly what he did. So you start messing around with the chemistry in the brain, and you can end up with something that's not so good. So I'm sorry, I cut you off, but talk more about what you found as you started researching.
So I suppose that the things that I started to find were that, as you have just said there, no one actually can predict how an antidepressant will affect you. You know, and for many people, what happens when they take an antidepressant is, instead of their life getting better, their life actually starts to get seriously worse than it was before. So that this, you know, we talk about antidepressants curing a chemical imbalance, and there's been a lot in the press about that recently. But actually what really happens is these drugs actually create a chemical imbalance. So instead of changing our biochemistry, instead of curing our chemical imbalance, they actually create a chemical imbalance, which for many people can have significant life changes.
Now here is an incredible success. Roger Smith was kicked out of high school, was homeless, a drug addict, arrested multiple times, and yet this same man overcame incredible adversity and became the CEO of American Income Life Insurance, National Income Life Insurance, and Liberty National Life Insurance Companies. His journey is told in his new memoir, The Most Unlikely Leader. Roger is an example that no matter how low you go in life, you can always turn things around and become anything you set your mind to. If you are stuck in any real-life challenge, this book is a fantastic must-read for you. The Most Unlikely Leader, available on Amazon or wherever books are sold. Yep. And I think, too, as you said, like when we were talking about children, and let's just take ADHD medicine for an example. Oftentimes, if children are eating cereals that are low in protein, very high in carbohydrates and high in sugar, they'll bounce off the walls. When my boys were young, we would have birthday parties and, I fill them full of cake and then send them home. And, oh, well, and it's a funny example, but that there can be nutritional reasons for some of these problems that people are confronting. And those don't get looked at.
They don't get looked at because, as I say, we've been culturally programmed now to believe that if we're not happy or satisfied in life, then it's a biological issue, and we go and ask for drugs to cure us. And let's not beat around the bush here. These are not medicines. They are not. These are powerful psychiatric, psychotropic, brain-changing drugs.
Yep.
So to call them medicine is really a wrong thing to do.
Well, especially since I think, and I've seen surveys, if you will, that were done on psychiatrists, asking, how do you test? Are there physical tests for, mental disorders or mental diseases? And the answer is no.
No, there are no. And that's one thing that, we really have to think about is that if we have any other condition, for example, if we have, high blood pressure, then we go to a doctor and we have a test to see if we actually have this condition.
Right.
But when it comes to a mental health condition, and I hate the term mental health, but when it comes to our mental health conditions, there are no brain scans, there are no blood tests, there is nothing to prove that we, one, need medication, and two, that we have something biologically wrong with us.
It's completely subjective.
Completely subjective.
And based on the person who they're talking to. And I think sometimes, while I believe that a lot of the psychologists, psychiatrists, whoever are, have the person's best interest in mind, they don't know what to do.
Yeah, I think that is the problem, is that the options there are very limited. And I think especially in the States, you have a real shortage of psychologists, of psychiatrists, and also it's expensive, isn't it? It's expensive to get help that you really, really need. So, yeah, yep. I mean, I think ultimately, we can conclude by saying that, I suppose paradoxically, that the drugs that are supposed to help us and cure us, we're taking long term, and actually the exposure is leaving millions of people around the world with medical problems, to which there are no solutions.
What are some of those medical problems, Beverley?
Well, the one thing that I have to say is that, we really don't know the long-term effects of these drugs. So if you think that Prozac first arrived in 1988, I think it was, in the US.
Sounds right.
Right. So that's, 30 years ago. Yeah. And there are many millions of people who have taken an SSRI antidepressant for that length of time. Now, if you think about it, most research that is done when it comes to these drugs is pharmaceutical funded. So it's not independent research. So they
not
do
what you would call balanced research.
No. There's no balance whatsoever. And what happens is they do trials, and these trials generally last 6 months, a couple of years if we're lucky. So for all these people who have been on these drugs for 30 years, nobody knows, what really is happening to their body being exposed to these drugs for such lengthy periods. The only thing that I will say is, and this is why I was really keen to put patient testimonies in the book, is because, it's only from anecdotal evidence that we really know what is happening to people. It's not from medical research, it's not from academic research, it's only because of patient experiences.
And, here's my controversial statement. We have these, it's probably the same in the UK, but when we have one of these mass shootings here in the US, every single one of those shooters are on psychiatric medications. Every single one. And then the argument becomes, oh, they don't take it properly. Yeah.
Yeah, but I agree they don't take it properly. And this is the thing that, I talk about quite a lot in the book. When you take these drugs and you achieve a new sense of balance, which is exactly as I was speaking about earlier. So your brain chemistry has been changed. So you will reach a new balanced state. Okay. So, for example, if you are an 18-year-old, for example, somebody who might potentially be a school shooter, if they miss a few doses of their medication, or if their medication is increased, then that balance becomes disrupted. Okay? So their brain, which might have been, in a balanced state, suddenly becomes a very different brain. And this is something that we need more research to. We're asking the wrong questions, because what we really need to ask is, instead of asking, was this person mentally ill? We need to ask, was this person drugged?
Yes. And that's what I meant by the whole my Russian roulette comment. And I say this, over and over again, and it's similar with street drugs that we talk about. But I think, as you said, these are like psychotic medications. And the other thing that, and I spoke years and years ago to a psychiatrist, and she said, these particular psychiatric medications are really the only family of drugs where the side effect causes what you're taking the drug for in the first place. Like the antidepressants cause suicidal tendencies, and the anti-anxiety medicines can cause anxiety attacks, and it's just, it makes no sense, Beverley. It makes no sense to me.
Yeah, I've written a few articles actually precisely about that, the paradoxical effects of these drugs. And many people take them because, they're depressed, or others take them because they're anxious. And we find that actually they become more depressed.
Makes them worse.
They become more anxious. And then, Joni, what happens is they go back to their prescriber, and guess what?
And get more.
They get more. Their dosage is upped. They are switched to another. And that balance again that I talk about, whoa.
Yep.
We see it more and more.
You are listening to the Addiction Podcast, Point of No Return. For more information on the podcast, or to reach out if you have a story you would like to share with us, go to our Facebook page by the same name, or you can email us at theaddictionpodcast@yahoo.com, or go to our website, theaddictionpodcast.com, or call us at 727-314-7080. And please remember to subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, and give us a 5-star review. Sometimes. The hardest thing about getting someone into recovery is getting them to agree to treatment. Bobby Newman, a certified drug counselor with 30 years experience and an over 85% success rate as an interventionist, has created a series of 12 videos that you can use right now to learn every step to get your loved one to agree to treatment.
Call 866-989-4499 today.
And say the word podcast to get a 10% discount. Or go to newmaninterventions.com and type in the word podcast for a 10% discount. This service comes with a free 1-hour consultation with Bobby.
And Beverly, before I forget, if you could email me the links to those articles or some way that people can read those articles, I definitely want to include that in the notes for this podcast, because people have to get educated on these medications. They are not a quick fix. And, so often I think people think, oh, because a doctor prescribed it, it's okay. It was similar with OxyContin. Doctors prescribed it. It was okay. No, these are dangerous medications, and you need to be fully and completely informed. And I think that's part of your argument, that there is no full informed consent on these drugs.
I have to say that, I never say people shouldn't take these drugs.
Understood.
I never say that, because it's everybody's right, isn't it, if they want to. But I do say that everybody should be informed to the best of their ability. It's like we live in the age of the consumer. We do 3 billion Google searches a day. We want to know about something before we buy it. But we kind of live in this strange world where we still think, as you just said, just because a doctor prescribes it, doctor knows best, and therefore I don't need to do that. But, we need to educate ourselves about these drugs. We really do. And educate ourselves to the best of our ability. It's a complicated subject and it's a complex issue. But I think, we really, and especially when it comes to medicating our children.
Yes. I remember one time, Beverly, I have always been against the ADHD medications, and I Googled something about it. I can't remember. And I found this poor woman who had I think he was 16 years old. He was on 3 different medications, because what parents may not realize, and you know this, so I know I'm preaching to the choir, ADHD medicines for young children are not depressant, but they slow you down. But then when the child reaches puberty, that same medication now becomes a stimulant. So now you have to take another medication to counteract the ADHD medication. And then, and that's the other thing, is some of the side effects of these drugs. You have to take more and more and more and more drugs to handle the side effects. And when do you go, yep, nope, no more?
Yeah, I think you're right. One of the big issues that we have, especially with elderly people at the moment, is polypharmacy. I think the average, I hope I'm right when I say this, I think the average person over 65 in the UK can take up to 10 different medications. And I think that must be similar statistics in the States as well. Yep. We are drugging our elderly. We really are. And this needs to stop. They're just one of the populations that are, I write in the book, special concerns about certain populations, one being children, one being the elderly, and one being, armed forces and veterans, who again are people who are being drugged unnecessarily for the situations that they find themselves in.
Yep. I remember I read that in your book. I was going to ask you about that, about certain segments of the population really being targeted with some of these medications.
Yeah, and it is targeting. I mean, it is strategic targeting with children. It's so easy, isn't it? Because generally parents have bought into the notion that if there's something wrong with you and you're not coping with life, then you take a drug. And they've passed it on to their children. And I have to say, this is a moral issue. What right do we have to change our child's brain chemistry? what right does any parent have to do that?
None.
In my opinion, none. And don't get me wrong, there are people, just as I say, you know, I don't say people should never take these drugs. There are people who are in very, you know, severe difficulty, and drugs do have a place. Some drugs do have a place, but not with children. Not with children. There are many options we can try before we medicate our children. When you think about it, all these people who, I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot, all these people who have been on SSRI antidepressants for, you know, 30 years, we have or a generation of children who are growing up drug dependent. So if they're put on drugs at a young age, and some of them are put on drugs at 5 years old, 6 years old, by the time they get to adulthood, they're already dependent on these drugs. They've already reached that state where their brain is balanced differently. If they are not educated about these drugs and what has happened to them and their system, do you know what happens and why suicide rates are going up in universities? These kids who are medicated go off to university, okay? They're not informed properly about the drugs. They think, I don't need to take that anymore. And they stop taking them.
Wow. Wow. Beverley, what do you see as the biggest antidepressant being prescribed today?
I think probably citalopram.
Say that again, sorry?
Citalopram, probably.
I wonder what that is in the U.S. I haven't heard of that one.
Sorry?
I said I wonder,
Oh,
sorry.
yeah. Yeah, I think so. I'm
Just
not
curious.
sure.
Just
Yeah, I'm
curious.
not sure. But
It's not important. I mean, they're all like antidepressants. Would you include anti-anxiety medicines in these? I mean, I would, but it's your book, your subject.
no, I mean, I don't. I specialize in antidepressants,
Okay.
and then my next book is benzodiazepines. So they're my two sort of key areas.
Yep.
Yeah. So, and I think one thing that I would like to say before I forget is that I'm not an addiction expert at all, but it is interesting. It really needs to be spoken about on this podcast, because most people who become dependent on antidepressants have a real issue with being called an addict.
Yep.
Because they've, you know, taken the drug as prescribed by a professional. They have a real issue with the term addict. So, you know, I work with dependents, and I think there are a lot of differences and a lot of commonalities when it comes to addiction and dependence. I don't think it's purely simple to say this is addiction and this is dependence. And, you know, we've also said, you know, these drugs, just like illicit drugs, they cross the blood-brain barrier, they disrupt the balance of the chemicals in the brain. And, you know, we need to think about, you know, and talk more about, I think, and that's why I was quite excited to be with you today, because I do think people really need to understand more about the difference between addiction and dependence.
I agree. What are some of the, like you've done a lot of patient interviews. What have they talked about in terms of long-term negative effects of taking these?
Well, I've got a bit from my book, actually, that I can just very briefly read to you, because this is a really, really good study that was done. So this is a 2018 study, and it said, asking people directly reveals far higher rates of adverse responses and long-term responses than previously understood, especially in the emotional, psychological, and interpersonal domains. So from this study, people were asked about their adverse effects. And you'll be really shocked when you hear the figures for these.
I doubt it.
Yeah, probably not. I'm preaching to the converted. So feeling emotionally numb, 70.6%. Feeling foggy or detached, 70%. Not feeling like myself, 66%. Sexual difficulties, 66%. Reduction in positive feelings, which is what we were talking about, the paradoxical effects. So reduction in positive feelings, 60%. Suicidality, 50.3%. So half the people who take antidepressants had,
Half.
yeah,
Yeah, half. And those percentages are horrifying, in my opinion. Who wants to go through life numb? Who wants to go through life, unhappy? Who wants to go through life having suicidal tendencies? I mean, why would you go there? I'm just saying that to the audience, not you. I'm just saying those are horrifying percentages. The name of your book and how they can find it.
My book is called Antidepressed, and it can be found on Amazon or on all the major book sites. It was released in January, and I'm really hoping Antidepressed will. I wanted to write a book in a really accessible form, so it's written so that we can all understand the complexities of these drugs. I didn't write it in medical language. I didn't write it in academic language. I just wrote it as simply as I could. It contains many patient testimonies, which are real life, experiences of really heartbreaking stories, including, suicide, including murder. I think I have the story from the film in my book, the experience from the film in my book, actually.
Wow.
And I have to say that there is a little warning before the testimonies, because for some people they can be triggering. And I think people, have to be really careful that they're in the correct frame of mind when they start to read them.
Right. But let me just say, I don't know about you, the listener, but when I go to Amazon, let's say, and I want to buy a drill, what I do is I sort by customer review. And if you're going to take an antidepressant, which is a very dangerous brain-altering medication, you might want to look at some of these testimonials in the same way that you look at customer reviews, because all the pharmaceutical company is going to tell you and all the doctor is going to tell you is how this might benefit you. But you need to know how it might harm you. And I think that, if you're going to do research, Beverley talked about doing research on these drugs. Well, her book is a good way to start. And the book, once again, is Antidepressed, and you can get it on Amazon. And I would say if you are thinking about taking antidepressants, or if you've been taking them, I think you should read it. Even if it scares you, I think you should read it. And let me also just say that coming off of something like an antidepressant, if you decide you don't want to take it anymore, you cannot just cold turkey. That is part of the danger of these drugs. You can become a heroin addict and you can cold turkey off of heroin. But you need to see a doctor if you are on antidepressants and you decide you don't want to take it anymore.
Yeah, and I speak about that an awful lot in the book, because one of the major problems that we have is that, when people have been taking these drugs for long periods of time and they do choose to reduce their medication, there's nowhere for them to get help. Now, in the States, Joni, you have, and you shouldn't really be proud, not you personally, but you shouldn't be proud of this, that hundreds of state-of-the-art clinics that are very, very quick to relieve people of thousands and thousands of dollars to get them off psychotropic medication. It can't be done in a few weeks.
No.
It can't be done. And I urge people not to waste their money trying to do that in what are essentially, illicit drug and alcohol clinics, rehab centers. we desperately need more services to help people. But there again, we could talk about this for hours, but there again, the problem is that we know so little still about the best way to withdraw from these drugs.
Yep.
We really do. And we desperately need more research, because people are being terribly harmed when they try to reduce their medication.
Yep, exactly. Well, Beverley, thank you for talking to us today. Thank you for writing this book. You have delved into an area that it's pretty scary. And I think that to really do a good job on this subject, which I believe you have, you have to have a confront of a certain amount of evil, because there is some of that behind the prescribing of these drugs. And similar to what we've talked about with Purdue Pharma and OxyContin, it's the same thing with Eli Lilly and Prozac and the companies that manufacture and distribute these drugs without really caring about anything but the bottom line. And you've confronted that, and that's huge. And I thank you for writing this book. And once again, I urge the listeners, find Beverley's book, Beverley Thomson, Thomson, and it's Antidepressed. Thank you so much, Beverley. I look forward to your next book on benzodiazepines, and we'll talk about that when you do that one.
Thank you so much for talking with me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening today. If you are considering taking any of these antidepressants, or if you have a loved one who is taking them, I strongly suggest you get her book, Antidepressed, by Beverley Thomson, Thomson. It's available on Amazon. You need to educate yourself. While these drugs may help in the very short term, you definitely do not want to stay on these drugs long term. And that's me, who's not a doctor. So personally, I wouldn't take them at all, but I'm not judging you if you do. However, you do need to get educated. You are responsible for your own health, physical, mental, and spiritual. Do not depend on someone else to handle it for you. Thank you for listening. We will be back again with another interview next week.
You have been listening to the Addiction Podcast, Point of No Return. For more information, reach out to us on Facebook or go to www.theaddictionpodcast.com. Our email is theaddictionpodcast@yahoo.com.